Welcome everyone to this CG webinar. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars focusing on exploring the outcomes of educating scientists and engineers. So it's great to have you all here. We're really looking forward to this series. One thing I should say at the beginning, and I'll mention again just before Jan starts for people who've come in a little later, is unfortunately Reneé Smith isn't able to join us today. So Jan will be taking the webinar and has kind of had to extend what she said at very short notice. So just so you're aware of that. Before I give an introduction to the webinar series and the project that it's based upon, just to give you a few pieces of housekeeping before we begin. So the first thing to remember to be aware of is that this Zoom webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on the website that you can see there. So be aware that if you ask a question, that will be recorded. Then just a few things about the ways in which these webinar works. So first of all, it's best to have the view in Zoom on speaker view so that you're focused on the person who's speaking. Secondly, please keep yourself muted so that everyone can hear the speaker very clearly. When we move to questions at the end, then you can unmute yourself if you're called on to ask a question. You can either have your video on or off as you prefer, and there's the stop video button towards the bottom. Most importantly, in this introduction is to remind you to ask questions in the chat part of Zoom. So the way in which we move to questions after the presentation is that I, as chair, will be monitoring the chat and then using the reply to an individual within the chat to line people up to ask questions once we move to that part. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask or a comment that you'd like to make, please put that in the chat as soon as possible. And those who put in earlier tend to get selected earlier. So a bit of encouragement to do so. And I'm sure as the webinar works its way through, I shall be sending messages encouraging you to share your thoughts in the chat. So first of all, let's move on to the project that this webinar series is based upon. So this is based on a project that's now coming to an end, where we've been examining graduate experiences of employability and knowledge on what we call the GEEP project. This is the second half of a 7-year longitudinal study of students studying chemistry and chemical engineering in 2 English, 2 South African, and 2 US universities. So what we did was we started interviewing people in the first year of their degree in chemistry or their degree in chemical engineering, and then we interviewed them each subsequent year. So for the first part of the project for 4 years, and then in this part of the project for another 3 years. So this has been a project conducted by an international team. So a group of us based in the UK, so myself and Jan, who's presenting today, as well as Kaylee Rosewell and Dee Dalgleish, based at Lancaster University. So then a South African team with Margaret Blackie from Rhodes University and Reneé Smith from University of Cape Town, and Ashish Garl, who was based at the University of Cape Town during the research. And then a US team who are all based at Virginia Tech, of Jenny Case, Nicole Peterson, Alaa Abdullah, and Benjamin Goldschneider. It's really important to say that whilst we have 3 international teams reflecting the countries involved in the study, is that we didn't base the study around different countries' case studies. It wasn't that the US team worked on the US data and so on. We all worked on all of the data together. And within this team, we have some researchers who are focused on higher education, like myself and Jan, some who are chemistry educators like Mags Blackie, and others who are more engineering and chemical engineering educators such as Reneé Smith, Jenny Case, and Nicole. So lots of kind of cross expertise in the group. So we track students through their undergraduate degrees, and by the end of that first 4 years, we had 42 chemistry students and 43 chemical engineering students who we saw through to the end. We started with around 60 in each subject. And then by the end of the 7 years, we had 38 chemistry and 33 chemical engineering graduates left in the study who were part of that original 42 and 43. And we're really pleased with the high level of retention in the study. And really, this is down to the excellent work of Kaylee Rosewell, who did all of the interviews on Zoom in the second part of the project. And she did a brilliant job in, first of all, doing interviews of an amazing quality and also keeping those graduates involved in the study. So I just, at this stage, like to publicly thank Kaylee for her amazing work. So that's the kind of project, that's what we're looking at. And then this is how it feeds in to the webinar series that we're doing. So today, Jan, and as I said, originally it's going to be with Reneé, will focus on the program leaders' reflections on the educational intentions of their program. So we'll start off with that framing of this is what the degree programs are trying to do. And then in the next webinar on Thursday, again at this time, Mags Blackie and Ashish Agarwal will look at how the graduates reflect on what they gain from their university degrees, particularly in relation to the ways in which their engagement with chemistry knowledge or the knowledge of chemical engineering came to shape and influence them as graduates. So that will be the second webinar on Thursday. Then next Tuesday, Nicole Peterson and Ala Abdullah from Virginia Tech will focus on the graduates' reflections on their roles in society, how that related to their professional expectations and their personal motivations. And then a week on Thursday, in the final webinar, Jenny Case and I will reflect on graduates' knowledge and society and think about what does the project say as a whole. So that's how the webinar series will work, and that's how the different webinars connect. So now I'll move on to introduce Jan MacArthur, who will be giving today's webinar on enabling change. So Jan is a senior lecturer and head of the Department of Educational Research at the University of Lancaster, where I'm also based. She is a key member of this project who's brought a great deal of expertise to the project, particularly in relation to ideas around the connections between education and society and social justice and assessment. And Jan's done really seminal work on assessment for social justice in higher education. So it's brilliant that we've got Jan to kick off this webinar series. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Jan.
Thanks, Paul. I'll just get my slides up, everybody. And they were just here a minute ago. Hold on. Excuse me, everyone. Sorry. I did something earlier with my slides so that we would have a backup. And now I haven't got them right in front of me. So just a moment and I'll get them up. Okay. Right. Can you see my screen? No.
Yeah, we can see that now, Jan.
You can see the slides?
Yeah, but you're not on presentation mode yet, but we can see the slide.
Yep. There you go.
We can see that now, yeah.
Great. Sorry, everyone, for slight hiccup. So as Paul said, sadly, Reneé can't be here today. And what we planned to do is Reneé was going to talk about the educational intentions, and I was going to contrast it with to what extent were there broader social intentions in our interviews with the program teachers. So it was quite late notice when Reneé couldn't make it. So I've sort of combined the two. And I normally am a bit of a stickler for timing, but I might have to just skip a few slides here and there in order to have room for discussion. So please excuse me if it's not quite as slick as it should be. What I'm going to be talking about today are what we call the exit interviews. And these were with key informants in each of the departments that we studied. They were with disciplinary specialists who had a program overview and experience and had had some sort of leadership and or curriculum design role. And most were in very long-standing positions, e.g. over 20 years or even more. So it's their insights really. And what I thought I would try and do today is I'm going to work through each department and just to give you a sort of a flavor of how those teaching in the departments position them, what they see as the important parts of what they're trying to do. And this provides a background for you in the following presentations where you'll be hearing the bulk of our data, which is coming from the student perspective. So the sort of questions that I've asked when I was looking at the transcripts from the exit interviews is, how do they describe the discipline of chemistry or chemical engineering? How do they teach it? What are their approaches? And why? Why do they think the teaching of chemistry or chemical engineering matters? So if I begin with chemistry, and I'm going to work through, as I say, the 6 departments. So Argonne University is one from the US. And there the person described the department as small, as having a family atmosphere. So in the first year, your professor will know your name. But they aligned this with all having a world-renowned research culture. They foreground chemistry as about problem-solving skills, and that the aim of the program is to work towards independent projects, but these are scaffolded by prerequisites for different classes. So you must pass one module in order to be able to do the next one. They also noted that the institution is moving to experiential learning requirement, so that there'll be some sort of outside the classroom, an undergraduate research project or an internship will become part of the norm. And sort of when asked to sort of describe the most important thing about chemistry, they said, I would say problem-solving skills if you had to pick just one. When asked about, connections to the wider world, the response was, I mean, as far as a worldview, we hope that we have a set of culture, respect and acceptance and cooperation and teamwork. We do some of that in the lab and classes as well. So it's sort of a worldview, but it's still really very much based on the classroom and the program. Astatine is the other of the US institutions. Again, it's a small department. And so in selecting what to teach, they focus on the expertise of those who are there to teach. They claim that they provide a unique opportunity for undergraduate research. And this was something they wanted to stress very much, that they said of their graduates, they are going to have skills beyond what you would expect from a student who just went to labs that were standard labs attached to classes. So they see themselves as offering something more. By the time they are seniors and are taking these advanced electives, they are pretty independent and good thinkers and critical thinkers. And I won't go into this long quote, but basically they talked about that having an open door policy, that they felt that particularly after first year, students would know they can just knock on the door of faculty and talk to them about things and in a sense be involved in the whole culture of the department, even at the undergraduate level. This is an interesting quote, and I'll come back to it again too. They also observed they are fairly serious students. They are serious about their academics. I think they mean academic work. Sometimes I worry they're a little bit more serious or too serious. Erbium is from England, the first of our 2 English universities, and in chemistry, again, they have very low staff numbers, and that influences what they select to teach on the curriculum. So there's not a lot of flexibility, but they argue that that enables them to cover the basics very, very well. Although in addition, there's an unusually large computational component, and the aim is that the students have some specialism by 3rd or 4th year when they do their own project. And in this sort of slightly busy slide, But I think this is an interesting exchange where Mags, who's our chemistry person who did the chemistry exit interviews, asked, what about a sort of broader world view of what you do? And they said, well, actually, this is one of our downfalls. We don't really have much on sustainability and green chemistry. We don't really have much of a wider picture. But as a counter, they said, but the degree has very much been set up to produce a chemist that can go and work somewhere. And I point this out because when we come to chemical engineering at Erbium, there's an interesting contrast. But they did say at Erbium that it's very much a community vibe. I actually say to students, if you are someone who wants to hide at the back of the classroom and never get noticed, then don't come to our department, because we do know every single student and everyone works together and it is a community. Europium. Now, this is interesting. They say unusually all undergraduates do a research project. Well, by now we've already had 2 other institutions that say they offer a unique opportunity or an unusual opportunity for a research project. So this seems to be something that is increasingly part of these chemistry departments, but they are seeing themselves as different and set aside in offering it. At Europium, there is a large focus on analytic chemistry, and analytic science still remains the big employer, and we really do drive the analytical. And so this is consistent with their focus on employability. They push placements hard, but for some reason, students are increasingly less interested. They describe this as a bit of a mystery because in your placement year, you don't have to pay fees. But despite the focus on employability, placements seem to be going out of favour. And again, asked to sum up what was most important at Europium, they say it's going back to those laboratory-based skills. I think it tells employers that they are going to get a competent laboratory scientist, and that laboratory scientist will relatively unusually be trained in and understand to some level of depth analytical chemistry as a specialism. I think that's the big seller, and it seems to be reflected in those types of employers who continue to take our students. When asked about broader social issues, Europium said, and Europium would regard itself as a very diverse university in terms of its student makeup, but they said that there are university priorities in this area, but they tend to run alongside the courses. They're not embedded in them, and that inevitably means they're not mandatory to engage with. So again, they saw this as something that probably wasn't as much in the foreground as they would like. Now we're moving to South Africa and Samarium, where they had recently done a curriculum redesign with an integration of the different branches of chemistry, organic, inorganic, apologies for the typo, and physical. So there's one large first-year course that integrates these three parts of chemistry that are normally taught differently in separate models. And then the same in second year. But the informant said it hasn't worked that well. But they were still sort of working through this. There's no flexibility in the chemistry part of the degree, but interestingly, second majors are really encouraged. And so they said they had someone who'd done chemistry and astronomy, chemistry and music. And this person describing chemistry said, chemistry is beautiful. I actually think that chemistry is an amazing subject. And what I hope that we get through in our degree is just that some appreciation of, first of all, how broad the topic is and how many different branches and areas. And one of the amazing things about chemistry is the creativity that comes in. So we have a passionate teacher of chemistry here, and that comes through very clearly. Again, a very interesting quote. So if you're interested in chemistry, this is a fantastic, coming to this department, because there are so many different ways that you can go and be a chemist. But if you are not interested in chemistry, it is also quite a fabulous underpinning, because there's so many other things you can go and do. So I think what I would like to think people come out with is a good appreciation of the scientific method and the way that science actually operates, and that feels something that's really quite important at the moment. Then finally, they say this is where we do get a very strong connection to a broader world and a social responsibility. What I think we are aiming for is people who have an understanding and appreciation of the place of science and chemistry in the world. So things like an ethical underpinning to what are you doing and why are you doing it? And should you be doing it at all? Sodium initially seems quite a contrast, a little bit more straightforward, if you like, or focused on the discipline alone. But they also talk about this idea of chemistry is incredibly broad. This has come through all these interviews. It's incredibly broad, and they learn to bring some very disparate concepts together in order to understand the overall field. They say the interior of chemistry is multidisciplinary. If you miss one element, you cannot get it. And it's about a holistic worldview of where does chemistry fit into everything else. And so to sum up the chemistry exit interviews, there's a great emphasis on the parts and the whole of understanding chemistry as a discipline, the emphasis on breadth, the emphasis on problem solving, the idea that chemistry can be a portal into the scientific method. And they all very much see chemistry as about the center of the world, but have a varied sense of what that means and, you know, what sort of social responsibilities come with the studying of chemistry or the teaching of chemistry. So I'll move on now to chemical engineering and work through the same 6 departments. Before I do that, as I said at the start, one of the questions I was asking myself as I read these transcripts again is, you know, how would they describe their discipline? But what became clear is one significant difference, that the chemistry people didn't even talk about it. You know, I mean, there's a talk about organic, inorganic and that, but it wasn't problematic. It didn't feel a contested realm. In chemical engineering, it was much more complex. There was a sense for some of them that there was a real issue in defining and building their identity and what it meant to be in chemical engineering. What they had in common is that chemical engineering is about chemistry at scale, mass production using chemical processes, and industry-based application of chemistry at scale. But the responses do vary in the priorities and nuances in how those things are understood and manifested into the world. So if we begin at Argonne, back in one of our US institutions, they see preparation for industry as really their key focus, much more than graduate school. But they would argue that they are producing students of the highest level. There's a strong focus on experiential learning and the importance of a semester in industry. If you recall, the chemist from Argonne was really just seeing this as something that was being introduced across the institution. But here in chemical engineering, it's far more established. It's not mandatory, but strongly encouraged. At the moment, there's about 40% take up of having this semester out. And the idea extends into the capstone project at the end, which is shaped strongly by their industry links. So at Argonne Chemical Engineering, they're very proud of their industry links, and they inform the way that they teach. Teaching is done by tenured researchers, and again, there's an open culture inviting students to be part of that lab work. But interestingly, they were very reluctant to identify a distinctive Argonne style, you know, and asked, well, what is chemical engineering at Argonne like, unlike anywhere else? They really didn't want to answer that. Astatine, by contrast, had a very, very strong sense of what was distinctive about them. And they refer to their selling point as their focus on program educational objectives, which they called very exciting. And they referred to the 5 C's that they see for chemical engineering: competency in the discipline of chemical engineering, critical thinking ability, capacity to learn, cooperation, so that's teamwork, they said, and communication ability. And they see themselves as very student focused and about building deep and personal connections with their students. Here they said, we're a very student faculty. We strive to educate students from a much broader perspective than simply competency in the discipline, and that plays out into the 5 C's. We really promote students to engage in practices and activities that go beyond the classroom. That will give them this life perspective on the ambiguity of the world and science and their approach to it. I just love that quote, the ambiguity of the world and science and their approach to it. And they also said, I think this gets to the idea that we really value the life of the mind. We don't have a football team, but for many years we had a world championship chess team. And if you recall, the chemist from the same university said, I worry that our students are too serious. So, and this idea of the valuing the life of the mind came through very, very strongly here. If we now move back to England and Irbium University, they were very keen to say that chemical engineering is more than oil and gas. But by implication, they were saying that for a long time, that was the assumption that chemical engineering was about oil and gas production. They have a focus on sustainability, renewable resources, and the environment. And they see chemical engineering as about processes, and this is different to something like civil engineering. And the person described the overall department teaching approach as fairly conventional, and yet there had been one person who had a very different approach who'd since left, but pioneered a team-based approach. The students hated it at first, but came to accept it. They said they have a small teaching team of 8, and they argued that this leads to a lack of variety, but they've tried to turn that into a positive by the focus on sustainability as their sort of unique selling point, if you like, but that they're sort of not that adventurous beyond that because they feel limited by the small teaching team. They say they don't attract the entitled top students, but they get the enthusiastic tail. The entitled top students refers to a large urban university or several large urban universities where they think that they get a different type of chemical engineering student. But they say that this motivates their teaching. They like having the enthusiastic tail, and this is part of them being student focused and very friendly. You see how often, though, we've been hearing the self-description as student-focused and friendly, but not everywhere. At Europium, they had a very strong argument about what chemical engineering is, and argued that traditionally it falls within 2 identities of the core engineering and the broader applied sciences. But not at Europium, they said. They said for them, chemical engineering is about connections. It uniquely deals with mass transfer. It's also about process integration and process systems engineering. But the big thing they said is that chemical engineering, their aim was to create a chemical engineering program that is much stronger on chemistry. And they argued that their feedback from employers was that the chemical engineers often came out and they were good engineers, but they needed to learn their chemistry. So there is a really passionate for them that this is unambiguously, properly chemical engineering in their words. And yet to achieve that, in terms of the curriculum, there was a process of compromises and trials, things in, things out, to try and get that balance right of what they were trying to achieve. But here they are passionate about teaching, and this comes through very clearly. There's also a point that made about lab skills, that they strongly argued that they had to have a place that was specifically for lab skills, because if you try and always teach them alongside other things, then the focus is always on the other thing, the content, and not the lab skill. They aim to encourage confidence and courage. So in the use of calculations, not to be tied to them, but to be confident and courageous about what you could perhaps do to solve problems. And they see their breadth as a power, not a weakness. That some people might say, well, this is a very broad form approach, curriculum, and it maybe doesn't have any, sufficient, it's too shallow. But they say that their aim is very deliberately to look at breadth as a power. And they say, even if it means sacrificing some maths. And they said, I think it is very important to emphasize the idea that these are problem solvers within the engineering context. People able to operate in complex environments and use fundamental skills and fundamental knowledge, and that they've learned to solve problems they won't necessarily have seen before or again, set within the engineering context, and of course, specifically chemical engineering. And they really wanted to stress this point about excellence in teaching. Pardon me. European genuinely is an excellent teaching university, but it's also research active, and it has important research ambitions, but it's pursuing those without losing its focus on the students. So we genuinely do have a context in which our ambition to deliver the best chemical engineering program in the country is a realistic one. And I love this quote. They said, someone once said that chemical engineers are either in love with chemistry or they're in love with mathematics, and that chemistry is more sexy and glamorous than chemical engineering. What I want our graduates to graduate with is, I want them to be in love with chemical engineering. I don't want them to be wannabe chemists or wannabe mathematicians. I want them to love chemical engineering. We are not attracting the best and the brightest. We are attracting students who I firmly believe will do better because they've had the quality of education that we're giving them. And if you recall, Erbium also said, they talked about the enthusiastic tail. So both these institutions position themselves as not getting the so-called elite students, but loving the teaching of the ones they get. And he referred to European chemical engineering as a powerful education. And I've tried to unpack what they meant by this, but it's really multifaceted. It's connected to the nature of chemical engineering as they understand it with that heavy chemistry presence, but also simply the power of education. And if we move on to South Africa, to Samarium, they have an elective track that allows for choice between breadth and depth. So here, whereas at European, they were very proud that it was about breadth, here, different students can navigate the curriculum in different ways to enable a breadth or a depth approach. Students must do a language elective. The other electives, the electives that are based around chemistry and chemical engineering, are important to allow for research-led teaching, they argue. There's a move towards a more project-centered curriculum designed to deepen the understanding of theory. There was a lot of talk at Samarium about that theory-practice interface. And have a just-in-time approach, again, another typo, where they give the theory when the students are about to do the practice. They don't front load a whole lot of theory and expect the students to remember it a few weeks later. And they want their students to, over time, become more comfortable with open-ended projects and problems. And, oh, sorry, can you see there? Teamwork is very important here, including working across cultures. And I think that's a very specific to the South African context, the comment made there about working across cultures. So their students are driving a sense of the connection between chemical engineering and the wider world. So they see their students as wanting to save the environment. They want to focus on complex problem-solving skills, but not perfect. This is about workable solutions. And they observe there is a tendency to try and go into the smaller, fast-moving type of engineering sectors like water treatment, things which are in a way on the growth, water treatment, energy, startup, not traditional energy, but your sustainable energy startup type of things, environmental stuff. So that's how they see their students. Now, in a paper that I and three colleagues wrote, we found that this actually seems to get lost along the way for some of the students. or the students don't quite understand where they're being given opportunities to make these connections. So it's interesting that this is how the Samarium educators view their students. And this is referring to fees must fall, which you'll remember. And they're saying that part of the whole fees must fall environment in South Africa for their students was a rejection of the idea about the big petrochemicals, the big mining operations, and they wanting to do things in local community context. So, for example, in this program, they brought in a project about anaerobic digestion in a township setting. They got some funding, built a project around that, and they saw that was a really lovely way of, again, deepening the theory by this practical engagement, but practical engagement with a very real social problem that their students cared about. And finally, chemical engineering at sodium. The core that identifies chemical engineering as opposed to mechanical engineering that we sprang from, or electrical engineering, or whatever else it may be, is the idea that we have to have the skills to take the raw materials, produce the products that society wants on a large scale, and to do it so that the entities that are doing this are actually profitable. So again, with sodium, at first we seem to see quite a contrast with samarium's very environmental, sort of world-based perspective. And that's partly true, but it's actually a little bit more nuanced, because just to give a little bit of the background first. So at sodium chemical engineering, there had been flexibility in the program. It had decreased due to economic pressures on class sizes. So this has been a familiar theme through several of the departments we've looked at. There's a general first-year engineering focusing on problem-solving skills. They believe in a solid technical grounding. This comment worried me. They referred to this bell curve of abilities in their students, which suggests there's sort of an inevitability of weak and stronger students, which anyway, I'm just putting it there because I found it a little bit concerning, but I'm not sure, perhaps I've misunderstood it. But they said that ultimately it is about the end result of problem solving. And in their view, variances in how that develops along the way are not really important. The main thing is that chemical engineers come out as these problem solvers. And as I said, sort of comparing already to europium, erbium, samarium, there doesn't seem to be the same social focus that was clearly coming through there. But I think that there's a change happening at sodium, and they are recognizing this. So our context said, it's become apparent to engineers that we are not simply people who sit on chemical plants or whatever it may be in isolation from the rest of the world. It's very interesting to say that it's become apparent, suggesting that they once thought they were in isolation. So we need, of course, to be involved and to understand how the rest of the world works and how we interact with it. And things are quite particular to the South African context, but also maybe a little bit more general than that. And we've introduced modules that we hope give our students that kind of exposure as well. So to summarize chemical engineering, this emphasis is on scale, a sense of challenging the old oil and gas image. So there's a sense of a discipline, perhaps in transformation, responding to world events. Like chemistry, there's this incredible emphasis on problem solving. But I would say that across the departments, there's probably more variation than we saw within the chemistry departments. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, everyone. I'll stop there, but I hope that gives you some background of understanding what the educators were aiming for, what they think is going on for the following seminars when you'll get the student perspectives.
Thanks, Jan. I've been encouraging questions in the chat, but so far they've not been coming in. So why don't we use this space for you just to have a bit more space for reflection on when you think about, though, it's a lot to hold in your head, but kind of 12 different programs with different approaches to producing graduates and different relationships between knowledge and society and the graduates. Yeah, are there particular things that stand out for you in terms of of what seems to be crucial in the kind of scientists and engineers who are produced through these educational processes?
I was surprised that both the chemists and the chemical engineers had this enormous stress on problem solving. Now, this could be, even after all these years, maybe I've still not, I just, there are other things I thought that those in chemistry would mention or put more at the foreground than the problem solving. So that was the first thing. The other thing is, of course, it's a very strange experience reading these interviews after we've had all these years immersed in the student experience. So there is a little bit of a sense of, and I'm not, this is true of all of us as educators, a little bit of a sense of, really, you think that's what's going on? You should talk to your students, So I was both reassured by some of the aspirations, but there was a bit of me at the back thinking, as you know, we've talked about this as a project team, that what characterizes both of these disciplinary curricula is that they're very, very busy and they're packed full of stuff, and the students are working all the time. So some of these nicer aspirations just weren't, there isn't the space for those social connections to be made. So I was reassured that they were wanting it, but I think they probably, would need to go back and think a little bit more about it. Doesn't just happen. And as the person who said, I forget where it was European. If you just have these big university aspirations that, we're going to have global citizens, this and that, and if it's just running along the side and it's not integrated, it doesn't actually happen.
That's great. Excellent. Thank you. We now have a question from Grant Campbell. Grant, would you like to turn on your video and unmute yourself and ask your question? We can't actually hear you, Grant. You appear to be unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you a bit louder now, yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. That was fascinating. Really enjoyed listening to that. You've given us a helpful sort of overview of what the various participants said. Have you synthesized from that any sort of sense of what we as chemical engineering educators should be doing and thinking differently in order to move the chemical engineering discipline forward?
Part of me thinks it's not really for me to say. It would be a bit presumptuous because you've probably just had the full extent of my knowledge of chemical engineering. But I think what struck me is that actually there isn't a need, maybe there isn't a need to pin down that chemical engineering should be one thing or the other. Maybe it would be quite nice across the discipline to have that. I sense that maybe it is okay to have, European saying we're going to be serious chemistry. It's going to be proper, real chemistry here. Maybe we need different types of chemical engineers. I think the idea, though, of chemical engineering responding to the climate emergency and the central place as a discipline you're likely to have in that is something that sort of was there, but yet to be developed, because clearly it seems to me that the business of chemical engineering is always going to be closely connected to the sorts of issues that we're facing there. So for me, that would be the more important thing, and allow for a bit of diversity in how you understand, as long as you don't get confused and you know that you might have different views of what chemical engineering is.
Thank you for those comments. I think both of those comments are spot on, Jan. I think that you're quite right that chemical engineering, in order to cover the diversity, the inherent diversity of the topic, and of the industries that chemical engineers go into, no individual program can cover that full scope. And so the only way that we can serve those industries is if individual programs have distinctive emphases and therefore look quite different. So I think that comment is perceptive and quite right. And I think you're quite right as well that chemical engineers are uniquely placed to address issues of climate change, because only chemical engineers deal with things at that scale and can have an impact at that scale. So yeah, thank you for both of those comments, which, yeah, I think that there's very perceptive things to have elicited from what you've been thinking about in response to these interviews. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant.
Thanks, Grant. That's great. We'll next go to C. Sanger. Would you like to ask your question? Oh, here we go.
All right, here
Hi.
we are. Yeah. Okay. Hi. Would you like to say a bit more about that bell curve of abilities that you mentioned? What was it that you thought might be problematic about it? I'm curious.
Well, it probably starts because as Paul mentioned, one of my main focuses of research is on assessment. And in an assessment context, bell curves frighten the life out of me. You know, the idea that you know, a certain proportion of students should always fail and sort of things like that. And so I have a real problem with them when people bring them into assessment. So I suppose I was seeing it in the same way of, it depends whether, the reason I was a bit cautious about being too critical is it depends whether they were talking about the outcome, that they, you know, oh yeah, well, we produce this, you know, a bell curve of different, you know, different abilities, or whether they're saying they start with a diversity of, you know, students with different strengths and weaknesses, and then they work with that, you know, because I think Europium and Erbium, where they talked about, you know, the enthusiastic tale, and I forget what the other expression was, they showed a real passion for teaching, you know, that teaching becomes teaching when you're doing it with the people, with the students who might need some help. But they really saw that there was potential for those students to flourish in really good ways, simply because they didn't come in as that, what they refer, their words, not mine, as the entitled elite.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't like the idea that we assume that there is a fixed ratio of abilities or outcomes. That would be my thing.
Okay, no, that's clarified. Yes, there obviously isn't a fixed normal curve here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we'll now move on to Teresa. Teresa, do you want to ask your question, or shall I?
Sure. I'm happy to ask the question. Thank you very much, Paul. I was just really interested in the comments about problem solving, because I've also experienced that many times people will talk a lot about problem solving. I have a colleague who says, you know, babies problem solve and doctors and teachers problem solve. So I'm just interested in Jan's thoughts on why she thinks there is this focus on problem solving above anything else.
This is just a guess from me thinking about this over the last few days, but I just wonder whether it's the term of the moment. You know, that if this was 5 years ago, everyone would have been saying critical thinking. So there were a few mentions of critical thinking there, but problem solving, I think, is being used as people wanting to present their disciplines as being relevant, and an assumption of relevance meaning relevant in the sense of for paid employment, you know, for the world of work. So I think it just feeds into that idea of people wanting to be very clear that in chemistry, I mean, chemical engineering, the vocational aspect is more apparent. But I think the chemists were also wanting to make clear that students have a future with this chemistry, that they go and it gives them these more general skills, which it's interesting in the interviews that we didn't go into that more, because it would have been quite interesting to do that, I think. I sort of expected to hear more passionate talk about molecules and stuff. We did have the person, again, I think it was a Sumerian, who talked about loving chemistry and just loving the creativity. So I think that's a quite a nice contrast. I think for the others, it was this sense of that's the term of the moment that we use to talk about, you know, being relevant in the world of work, is my guess. It's closely aligned to the idea of, you know, everyone's talking about authentic assessment at the moment in this sort of way of world of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree about it being a bit performative. Yeah, the comment there.
Just there's kind of bit discussion between Grant Campbell and Sanger about that comment, but just while we wait for other questions from others, I was and it relates back to Grant's question around chemical engineering and something you presented around needing to know what chemical engineering was, because we found, unlike chemistry, the students, when we interviewed them, really struggled to know what chemical engineering was. Unlike chemistry, we had quite a few who, even a few years in, couldn't tell us what they thought chemical engineering was. So I'd be interested in having a look closely at those different interviews around chemical engineering. Clearly you talked about the importance of varieties of chemical engineering, but did you get a sense of a core that would cross all chemical engineering programs? And I mean this education. Clearly I'm not asking you about the knowledge of chemical engineering, but more kind of in terms of, unless you want to go there, more in terms of a kind of educational project of doing chemical engineering.
I think, well, it really does sort of come back to that problem solving thing, although it's complicated by how much that was apparent with chemistry too. So it doesn't really help in a way. But I think the idea of scale is very important to chemical engineering, as again, we don't want to get into my knowledge of chemical engineering, but the importance of scale and the importance of educating students to be able to respond to issues of scale and also unpredictability. There was a really lovely quote there about saying, look, they're going to be asked to do something that they've not seen before and they probably won't see again. And they have to have this core knowledge and ways of applying it that can always respond to that uncertainty. So it's never going to be a certain thing. And I think that's why I also said chemical engineering, I think, is interesting to keep an eye on at the moment because of this sort of transition. If we link it to things like the climate emergency of the the idea it's not just oil and gas, but the same sorts of knowledge can be applied in other sorts of ways. And there was a quote I didn't use because it was a little bit technical, and so I didn't fully understand it, but it was talking about a certain process that is normally taught using an example from the oil industry, and how you could take an example in sort of green energy and you do just the same sort of thing, but people traditionally never did. So but I do think there is that about unpredictability. This is not about learning by rote that, okay, in this situation, you always do this. That seems to be key.
Right. The chat seems to have calmed down, but we've still got 5 minutes. So if people want to kind of use the reactions button to raise their hand. Oh, hold on, I've got a new message. That's Grant going. Thanks for coming, Grant. Any other questions that people wish to raise at this stage? Okay, well, I think that's testament to your very clear presentation, Jan, and a really rich insight into the different approaches in these programs. So thank you very much for that. Is there anything you want to say in kind of summary to finish up?
No, just thank you to the chemical engineers and chemists out there who haven't been laughing too uproariously as I've tried to as an educator to understand your disciplines.
That's great. Thanks, Jan. So as I mentioned, that was the first in a series of 4 webinars that we're going to look at these issues around educating scientists and engineers. So the next webinar is on Thursday, and that is called Shaped by Knowledge: Science and Engineering Graduates' Reflections on what's their gain from their university degrees, and that will be with Margaret Blackie and Ashish Agarwal. We really look forward to seeing you all then. A recording of this session will be posted on the CG website in the coming few days. So thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks to Jan for an excellent presentation, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.